All right, so before we jump into the sermon, just a few announcements. The first is, and these are actually mostly printed on your bulletin, so you can follow along there on the back page there. I just want to highlight that GEMS, our girls' youth ministry, is meeting today at 4 o'clock. They meet here in the cafeteria, and so if you know anybody in that age range or kids who has kids in that age range, please spread the word. Because, that ministry is growing, and that's exciting. It's a good group of girls, and Jill and Sarah and others do a great job leading that. Britta, I should mention as well. So that is today, 4 p.m. right here. I also want to mention, next one down, Hannah is starting a Lent Bible study, and that is going to be on Zoom. I have a little more information now than what is in your bulletin. That is going to meet on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. on Zoom. Wednesdays at 7 p.m. And Lent actually starts this coming Wednesday. So the first installment of the Bible study, I believe, will be this coming Wednesday. So if you have indicated your interest to Hannah, be watching for some information. Or if you don't see that, feel free to follow up with her. If you are interested in joining, reach out to Hannah. Her email is there, or she's in children's ministry today. You can catch her after worship as well. So that is starting this week, Wednesday. We mentioned this in the prayer, but I want to mention it now as well, that this week, Monday and Tuesday, is the Classis Lake Superior meeting. I believe I mentioned to you that we have sort of forwarded our communication onto Classis about the vote that we had and about how we sort of recognize that puts us out of alignment with what the Synod has decided. And so we're basically asking the Classis for advice and sort of saying, look, our way of viewing this is it seems like we need to start the process of disaffiliation, but we want to make sure we're understanding that correctly. We want to hear from the Classis on that. So I will have some conversation about that at Classis, and I will have an update for you by this time next week, and we'll see where the process goes. But just a reminder, if indeed we go on this process of disaffiliation, it's not like that'll happen overnight. That's not something that'll happen during this meeting tomorrow. It's probably about a year-long process where different meetings have to happen and that sort of thing. So just so you know, it's not happening like in the next couple of days, but I'll keep you all posted as best I can on that process. This is not in the bulletin, but I also wanted to make you aware, and this is related to the Classis stuff. So this week is Classis Lake Superior meeting. Next week, there is a meeting of a Classis that's part of the RCA, the Reformed Church in America. And that is one of these other denominations that could potentially be a good landing spot for us if we do indeed need to disaffiliate from the Christian Reformed Church. It's not the only option, but it is one of the options we are looking at. And they have a Classis that is called City Classis, and it's actually made up of congregations of churches all across the United States that are in sort of urban or, sort of greater metropolitan areas. And that's kind of the thing that binds these churches together, is that they have a somewhat similar ministry context. And I talked to them, one of their representatives, a couple of months ago, and I said, well, we're in Chanhassen, so we're kind of suburban, but we're definitely connected to the metro area. And they were like, I think that counts. We'd love to have you anyways. Anyways, again, I'm not saying this is definitely for sure where we're going, but it is one option. And that meeting is taking place March, whatever the Thursday is, that March 12 or 13. And it's in 13. Thanks, Joel, for the fact check. And it's taking place in Chicago. So I'm going to take a little road trip to Chicago, and I'll be there for that and kind of ask some questions, hear some things, and I'll be able to report back to you all on that as well. But I did just want to let you know that is happening. Okay, that's all I've got for announcements. Am I missing anything or anything that we should add? Okay. Then let's jump in to the message. A few years back, I read a cookbook that changed my life. It at least changed my cooking. Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. Is anybody familiar with this cookbook? Have you all seen this? They made a Netflix documentary out of it. I think actually this is the promotional photo from that, so maybe you saw that. It's by Samin Nosrat. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing her name. That's doing the best I can with that. The idea behind the book is that anywhere you go in the world, good food is really a matter of those 4 factors: salt, fat, acid, heat. And it really changed the way I approach cooking, but in particular, it revolutionized the way I prepare pasta. And I love pasta. It's my favorite food group. And before reading salt, fat, acid, heat, I would boil the water. I'd maybe add a pinch of salt. I'd throw the pasta in. And what I learned from reading the book is I was using nowhere near enough salt for making pasta. To properly salt your water for pasta, we're not talking about a pinch, we're not talking about a couple of, shakes of your salt grinder. We're talking heaps of salt. In fact, Samin Nosrat recommends per quart of water using between 1 and 2 tablespoons of salt for pasta, depending on the kind of salt you use. Now, I don't necessarily recommend this if you're on a low sodium diet or that sort of thing. Like, take the necessary precautions, but I'm telling you, it is a game changer. Before I learned this new technique, I never thought of pasta as having a particular flavor of its own. I just thought it was this wonderful texture that served mostly as a vehicle to bring delicious sauces to my mouth. But it turns out that if you allow the correct amount of salt to make its way into the pasta itself, it gives the noodles a taste all their own. For me, pasta will never be the same. It's truly a game changer. Okay, hang with me a moment while we completely transition to another illustration here. And really, it's just to briefly remind you of a story I told to open a sermon a few months ago. So I'm sure you all remember this perfectly well and sticking in your mind and all that. But this is a story I told about a time when I was living in Colorado and I climbed a mountain in the middle of the night. And the idea was to reach the summit at sunrise. But due to an error in our calculations of how long it would take us to get to the summit, we ended up there way too early. Sunrise was maybe an hour and 15 minutes yet away, and it was dark, and it was cold, and it was uncomfortable, and you could see well enough to move around, but really everything was just sort of shades of gray. Everything was just sort of in shadow. You couldn't really see what you were doing, and you really had to be quite careful where you stepped. But as soon as the sun rose up, and it flooded our bodies with warmth, and it flooded the landscape with its light, that cold, hard landscape was transformed into a beautiful Rocky Mountain sunrise. And you could see, you could make out all the vegetation and different rocks, but then the beautiful valley down below, and then the mountain ranges in the distance. And you began to see things that you had no idea were there, and you didn't realize just how good and beautiful it was until the light was shining. The light made a world of difference. Okay, we are in a series on Jesus' most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. And last week, just a quick recap, we looked at Jesus' introductory blessings, right? They're called the Beatitudes. The blessings for the down and out of the world. These are the folks that Jesus has come to especially be with, and to partner with, and to work with in his kingdom. And in this next section, just after the Beatitudes, Jesus continues to bless these down and out disciples that are in the crowd. And he blesses them by helping them see their own God-given identity of who they are. And he uses 2 metaphors to describe this identity. He says to his disciples, "You are the salt of the earth, and you are the light of the world." So let's take a look at this text now. It'll be on the screen, but I encourage you to have it. It's in your bulletin. Have it in front of you, or maybe look it up on your phone as well so that you can refer back to it. Matthew 5, starting at verse 13. Again, this comes right after those opening Beatitudes, those opening blessings. Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So again, last week we looked at the Beatitudes, and one of the things we noted was that Jesus blesses before he commands. Right? The structure of the Sermon on the Mount is, here's the grace that Jesus is giving to us, and then it's, here's what follows from that. Here's how you live out that grace. As we move into verses 13 to 16, it's starting to feel a little bit more like commands, right? Like, go out there and be salt. Go out there and be the light of the world. But notice that even here, Jesus isn't commanding so much as he's describing what already is true. In other words, Jesus isn't really being prescriptive here. He's being descriptive. He's describing what is already true of his disciples. He's looking out at the disciples in front of him and he says, no, you are salt. You are light. He's not saying, go out in the world and be the best salt you can, or try really hard to be the light. He's saying, no, you already are. Now let's picture the moment, Sermon on the Mount, he's gathered this crowd of disciples around him. I kind of imagine at these words, especially as Jesus really turns to it's directly at them. He uses in that second person you, right? He moves from blessed are those to you are the light. And I kind of like to imagine that there's this sort of looks of joyful surprise on the faces of the disciples. And maybe there's even some murmuring through the crowd, did we hear that right? He's talking directly to us? Because remember, this is the down and out. These are the poor, grieving, unimportant disciples. And Jesus says, look, I know the world does not think very much of you. I know that you do not have very much influence out there, or power, or wealth, or means. And by the way, Jesus says, I know that you probably don't think that much of you. But you actually are an incredible force for good in this world. Not because of anything you've done, but because you are my disciples, and you're following me, and you're near to me. And so you are salt and you are light. Okay, so let's talk a little more about salt. We already mentioned that its benefit as a sort of flavor enhancer. Of course, we also know that salt can be used as a preservative, right, to keep food from going bad. And so the bottom line of the teaching here that Jesus has for us is that just as salt is meant to be a benefit to food, so Jesus' disciples are meant to be a benefit to the world in some way. And let's go back to salt, fat, acid, heat again, because Samin Nosrat says that one of the keys to making sure the salt can do its work is time. It takes time. We talked mostly about pasta, but there's other sections where she talks about meat, and depending on the cut of meat or the size of the meat, you're talking not just a couple hours before, but days before, making sure the salt gets on that meat so it can work its way in. And that's why with pasta, it happens a little more quickly. The water's boiling and all that. But you do it ahead of time, right? You salt the water first because it needs that 8 to 12 minutes or however long it is to work its way in, to do its flavor-enhancing work. If you forget to do that, which I have done, and I'm 6 minutes into the pasta boil, and I begin to lament, because there's really no way to make up that time. You might think that you can just shake some salt over the pasta once it's plated right before you eat it, but that doesn't work. The salt doesn't get into the noodles. It will just taste salty. And the same is true for us disciples here, who are meant to be the salt of the earth for the benefit of the world. We need time. We need to actually spend time out there in the world. We need to spend time with people, with our neighbors, with our friends and colleagues, investing in those relationships, investing in people who are in our sort of community networks. We need to invest time in order to bring the salt of the gospel into the world and into the lives of the people that Jesus places in our path. Let's bring it back to our mission statement for a moment. Our mission statement is that we are living out God's story of renewal out in our neighborhoods, right? That's really key, is that the image there is the salt of the earth, right? We are involved, we're embedded and engaged in our communities and our neighborhoods in order to bring about the salt of the gospel. But part of living out that story is inviting other people to come and be a part of that story as well. And that's the way we like to talk about, the word historically is evangelism, right? Evangelism, inviting other people or sharing the gospel with other people. We tend to talk about inviting other people to join in God's story as well. And the reason we do that is not because we want, more people in our worship services, although that would be great. And the main reason is we genuinely want people to experience the hope of the gospel, the joy of the gospel, the peace of the gospel. And when we think about inviting people into living out God's story, I think a lot of times, we do think of evangelism, and we think of this pressure to make sure we're sharing the gospel in every interaction with the people that we meet. There's this pressure of I need to make sure I'm, don't want to waste this opportunity. Now, I don't deny that sometimes that is indeed how the Spirit works, right? You find yourself in a conversation with somebody, and maybe they're a complete stranger, but the conversation just goes in a direction where you do have an opportunity to sort of share, here's the way that I've been impacted by living out God's story. So I don't want to shut that down, but I do think that's the exception. And I think more often, what we find is that if we move too quickly to share the gospel, or if we see that as the primary goal in any given interaction, it's not actually going to bring that benefit to the person we're talking with. It's just going to make you come across salty, right? It's like shaking the salt on the pasta after the fact rather than letting it have the time that it needs to do its work. And I think a better way that we can think about investing time and being the salt of the earth is actually captured by that book that we studied about almost a year ago now. If you recall, it was Bless. Hopefully this at least sort of looks familiar. But we did this book study as a church. We did a sermon series on it. It's still on YouTube if you want to go back. I think it was last May. But Bless is an acronym. And it's all about how we make these small sort of daily time investments in the lives of people we know or in the communities that we live in. And the acronym is, I'll just do it very quickly, B is begin with prayer, right? So before you're even out there in the world, start your day off with praying for people in your life or in your community, and lift them up in prayer. L is listen, right? So before we're out there trying to spread any particular message, let's spend some time listening. Let's ask some really good questions. Let's be curious about people's lives. And maybe as we get to know them more, we even get to a point where we don't just know what they're up to this weekend. We know something about their concerns or their desires, their hopes, their fears, right? So we listen. E is my personal favorite. It's eat together, right? And this is partly why we do the potluck once a month. But the idea is here, things happen when you're around the table sharing food with one another. You can be more open. You can do more listening. You can learn more about one another. So eat together. The first S is serve. And this can happen in two ways. First, it's, can you find some, in your listening to the person, can you find some way that you could offer to serve them? Could you be a sort of a physical or material benefit to their lives? Or you might find some way that they are out there in the community serving. And you go, hey, could I come with you to join you in that? I want to support you in that some way. And then finally, the last S is story. And really, and this happens sort of throughout the Bless process, but the idea is that if you're doing all of these other things, there will be opportunities to hear their story and to share your story and have that impact, that gospel impact on somebody's life. So it's not so much sprinkling a little gospel into our conversations. It's about actually investing in people's lives by spending time together, by listening well, by learning about them and being present with them in times of joy and sorrow. And this works on an individual level, right? Like with your neighbor or your friend. But it's important to keep this in mind for more on a societal level too, or if you think about the structures in our society. If, for example, say you want to make a real difference, a sort of salt of the earth difference in our school system, right? Well, you don't just show up to one school board meeting and start spouting off about all the things that need to change. You want to invest time getting to know the school. So maybe you want to volunteer at the school. Maybe you want to get to know the teachers or the administrators in some way. Maybe you attend multiple school board meetings and get to know them and ask some questions and listen really well. That's the way you make a real and lasting impact, whether it's with the school or any other network or societal structure that you say, hey, I want to kind of get involved there. It takes time. It reminds me of a story, or just a brief illustration that a pastor shared as part of the Renewal Lab when we were down in Florida. And this is a church that had a lot of, obvious impact on their community, and they're doing all these really great things. And it was easy to kind of go, wow, like, how did you do all these incredible things? You must have, worked really hard or had these brilliant ideas. And the way he talked about it was, he saw every interaction with people or with, community structures as just investing, one penny at a time. Right? One penny at a time in the piggy bank. So it's not a matter of making some big, giant impact all at once. It's just recognizing that over time, you take the long view and you have an impact that way. And I think that is part of what's going on here when Jesus says, you are salt. You are meant to be out there in the world, working your way into the lives of people and the lives of our communities that we are a part of. And again, a lot of this is just note the encouragement, the grace here, right? Jesus says, you are salt. That is your identity. However, it should be noted, again, refer back to your text, the very next thing Jesus follows up with that is sort of this, hey, salt can lose its saltiness. And when it loses its saltiness, it's no good anymore. What is Jesus saying here? Moving so quickly from this encouragement, we're excited, this is great, to this warning, really, about make sure you stay salty. What he's saying is, look, this is your identity. But you need to live it out. Those things go together. You need to actually practice this. What good would it be to be given this new identity as salt of the earth and then do nothing with it? Or the analogy I've heard is, what good is it if you receive a gift at Christmas and don't unwrap it, right? You've been given this gift. You want to unwrap it. You want to be able to, use it and go out in the world. So that, by the way, is a recurring theme throughout the sermon, right? It's Jesus blessing us with his grace. The invitation to discipleship is a gracious invitation. And yet there's this call to actually go and live it out. We need to, as Jesus will conclude in the sermon in Matthew 7, we need to put his words into practice. So I think that's what's going on here with this sort of stark warning to kind of just remind us, oh yeah, that's right, we do need, it's not to strike fear in our hearts that, oh man, we might lose our saltiness. It's just that reminder of, that's right, we actually do need to go out and practice these things. Okay, let's move on because we've got to talk about light of the world. And this will be a little bit of a shorter section, so don't worry about that. Jesus says, you are the light of the world. That's a pretty surprising statement when you couple it with the fact that in the Gospel of John, Jesus says that he is the light of the world. And there are other places, you look at some of the prophetic texts that talk about the light of the world that then get applied to Jesus in the New Testament. The main thrust of the New Testament is that Jesus is the light of the world. What is he doing here in Matthew chapter 5, saying, you, disciples, are the light of the world? Well, in Matthew chapter 5, it seems that Jesus, as light of the world, is willing and actually desires that his light be reflected by us as the light of the world out there as his disciples. He says, you are the light of the world. So the question is, well, what does that mean? What does that mean to be light of the world? And for Jesus, it's connected to this idea of doing good deeds. And now again, just note the connection here between Jesus' gracious identity, you are the light, and the call to put it into practice. It's connected to doing good deeds. It has to do with our actions out there in the world. Notice that Jesus does not say, let your light shine before others so that they can hear your brilliant theological arguments and be convinced of the truth. No, he says, let your light shine so that people will see your good deeds and then glorify your Father in heaven. So what are good deeds? What is Jesus after here? What does it actually look like to live this out? Well, we're going to see this a lot more closely over the next couple weeks as we make our way through the rest of Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus reinterprets the law for his disciples. And he spells out, here are the good deeds. Here's what it looks like to live this out. And so that's where we're headed over the next couple weeks. But to just give us a quick sneak peek now, it looks like this. And I'm getting this straight out of the rest of Matthew chapter 5. If you have your Bible open, you might be able to follow along in the paragraphs here. But just to sum it up, Jesus said, this is what Jesus is calling us to. In a world where we see so much anger, so much bitterness, hatred, divisiveness, the disciples of Jesus bring the light of peace and reconciliation and being willing to listen and having patience even with those who have wronged us. In a world that's characterized by broken relationships, by lust and abuse and exploitation, the disciples of Jesus bring the light of fidelity, of covenant loyalty, of marriages that last and that are committed and that they are characterized by care and concern and lifelong commitment, of other relationships that are durable and that last and that are characterized by being able to be mutually vulnerable and mutually looking out for the interest of the other. In a world where words mean so little, right, where you can post something on social media with very little accountability without really caring about what sort of impact it has, in a world where words are often the words of broken promises or words are meant to deceive, the disciples of Jesus bring the light of speaking simple words of truth, right? Jesus says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Simple words of truth. In a world that's defined by retribution and revenge and making sure you get what's yours, disciples of Jesus aren't so interested in getting revenge. They are interested in offering forgiveness. They are interested in following Jesus' example of absorbing wrong and absorbing the suffering and letting other people off the hook, which includes even love for enemies. And so that's a little summary of where Jesus is headed next in Matthew chapter 5. But for today, let's rest in that identity that Jesus gives us. He says, you are salt. You are light. And that is the case because of what he has done for us. And so let us rest in that identity and let us draw near to Jesus as his disciples so that we can be his salt in the world, that we can reflect his light more clearly to the world around us. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Jesus, thank you for this beautiful surprise that you call us the light of the world, that you, before we've done anything to merit it or prove our worth, you have made us salt and light to be of a benefit to the world around us. Help us to see where you are calling us to do that. Continue to give us the grace to put these things into practice. And we pray that you would use us to draw others nearer to you. That more people would see these good deeds and glorify you and orient their life around you. Again, not so that our, numbers can grow or we can feel good about ourselves, but so that more people can experience your gospel of goodness, peace, and love. We need you to be able to do that. Lead and guide the way, we pray.